Go sit in the back." My family pushed me aside, then a 4-star admiral walked straight up to me. My stepmother shoved me into the last row of the room and whispered something I will never forget. "Don't embarrass us. People like you don't belong in the front." What happened less than 10 minutes later left an entire hall of U.S. Navy officers frozen in silence. The highest-ranking admiral in the Navy ignored every VIP in the room, walked straight past my own family, and stopped in front of me. But before I tell you why one of the most respected military leaders in America saluted a woman her own family treated like she was invisible, you need to understand something. Respect isn't always stolen by strangers. Sometimes it's taken away by the people who are supposed to love you the most. And that was the story of my life. My name is Emilia Carter. For as long as I can remember, I was always the extra person in my own family. Not the daughter my father proudly introduced. Not the sister anyone bragged about. Just someone who happened to share the same last name. The morning of the ceremony began before sunrise. Washington, D.C. was still wrapped in the soft blue light of dawn as I stood in front of my apartment window, looking toward the city skyline. The invitation rested on my kitchen table beside a neatly pressed navy blue dress and a small velvet box containing a simple silver navy pin. The invitation had arrived 3 weeks earlier. Heavy cream-colored paper. Gold embossed. The official seal of the United States Navy stamped across the front. Inside were only a few words. The Department of the Navy respectfully requests your presence at the National Strategic Excellence Recognition Ceremony. There was no explanation. No mention of why I had been invited. Only instructions to arrive before 9 o'clock. Confidential. Formal attire. I had attended classified meetings before. I had spent years working inside secured facilities where people rarely used real names and conversations ended the moment an unfamiliar face entered the room. But this invitation felt different. Almost personal. I smiled quietly to myself. Whatever today was about, I assumed I would simply sit somewhere in the audience while senior officials discussed another successful project. Recognition had never mattered much to me. Results did. Knowing sailors made it home safely because of systems my team designed, that was enough. Public applause had never been the reason I accepted the job. My phone buzzed. It was my father. That alone surprised me. Robert Carter rarely called unless he needed something. I answered. "Good morning." His voice sounded unusually cheerful. "Ready yet?" "I was just leaving." "We'll pick you up in 20 minutes. For a moment I hesitated. "You want us to go together?" A short silence followed. Then he cleared his throat. "It'll look better." Look better. Not because he wanted to spend time with his daughter. Not because he was proud. Simply because appearances mattered. I should have declined. I almost did. But some small, foolish part of me still hoped today might be different. Maybe this ceremony would soften something inside him. Maybe, just for one day, we could act like a family. I closed the apartment door and carried that tiny hope with me. It would not survive the morning. 25 minutes later, a glossy black SUV stopped outside my building. Chris was sitting in the passenger seat scrolling through his phone. He barely looked up. Clarence, my stepmother, sat beside my father in the back. The moment I opened the door, her eyes swept over me from head to toe. She frowned. "That's what you're wearing?" I looked down at my dress. Simple. Elegant. Dark navy. Nothing flashy. It was requested in the invitation. She forced a thin smile. "I suppose." I climbed inside. The ride toward downtown Washington was painfully quiet. Chris laughed occasionally while watching videos. Clarence talked endlessly about who might attend the ceremony. I heard senators will be there. and several four-star officers. Imagine the networking opportunities. She adjusted the pearl necklace around her neck before glancing toward my father. Robert, remember to introduce Chris to everyone important. My father nodded. He needs the right connections. Neither of them asked me a single question. Not where I had been working. Not how I was doing. Not even why I had received the invitation. As if my presence required no explanation. After almost 30 minutes, Chris finally looked at me. So. He smirked. What exactly do you do these days? I smiled politely. Engineering. He laughed. That's all? Mostly. Clarence rolled her eyes. You've always been mysterious. She leaned closer. I still don't understand why someone like you received an invitation to this event. Neither did I. But I wasn't about to discuss classified work in the back seat of a moving vehicle. I work on government projects. Chris burst into laughter. You make it sound like you're some kind of secret agent. Even my father smiled. I simply looked out the window. Sometimes silence protects your dignity better than explanations ever could. As we crossed the bridge into central Washington, memories flooded my mind. There was a time when Dad wasn't like this. When I was little, he used to lift me onto his shoulders during 4th of July fireworks. He called me his little inventor because I constantly dismantled radios and clocks just to see how they worked. When I was 12, we built a model sailboat together. It barely floated. We laughed until sunset trying to keep it from sinking. Back then, I truly believed nothing could come between us. Everything changed after my mother died. Cancer stole her slowly. I was 14. The strongest woman I had ever known disappeared one painful day at a time. Dad changed after the funeral. Not immediately. Slowly. He smiled less. Worked longer hours. Stopped asking how school was going. A year later, he met Clarence. She was charming around guests. Perfect manners. Perfect smile. Perfect appearance. Everyone thought she was wonderful. I wanted to believe it too. The first few weeks after she moved in were peaceful. Then the rules began. Chris needs the larger bedroom. You don't need piano lessons. Don't interrupt adults. Don't wear that. Don't speak unless someone asks. Small things. Tiny cuts. Almost invisible. Until one day I realized I no longer felt like I belonged inside my own house. Dad noticed. I'm certain he did. But every time he had a choice between confrontation and silence. He chose silence. Silence became agreement. Agreement became habit. Habit became my life. Chris quickly learned how everything worked. If Clarence blamed me, Dad believed her. If Chris mocked me, nobody defended me. Eventually they stopped treating me like family. I became convenient. Someone expected to clean after everyone. Someone forgotten at birthdays. Someone who never complained. The only escape I had was studying. Math. Physics. Programming. Machines made sense. People rarely did. While other teenagers spent weekends at parties, I spent mine building software, repairing electronics, and teaching myself cybersecurity. Nobody noticed. Nobody cared. Except one person. Mrs. Eleanor Brooks. My high school physics teacher. One afternoon she caught me staying after class to repair a broken laboratory computer. She watched quietly for nearly 20 minutes before asking, "Who taught you this?" "I did." She smiled. "No, someone taught you how to think." I never forgot those words. She became the first adult who believed my mind was worth something. She encouraged me to apply for engineering scholarships, national competitions, government internships. Every application I completed felt like another door opening away from the life waiting at home. Years later, when I accepted a position with a federal defense research program, I didn't celebrate. I simply packed my bags, left quietly, and never looked back. At least, that's what I thought. The SUV slowed as armed security officers appeared ahead. Concrete barriers lined the entrance. American flags waved proudly outside one of the most prestigious military venues in Washington. Uniformed Marines stood perfectly still beside the gates. Guests wearing decorated uniforms and elegant evening attire stepped out of luxury vehicles one after another. Even Clarence looked impressed. "Oh my," she whispered. "This is incredible." Chris adjusted his expensive suit. "I told you this would be full of important people." My father straightened his jacket several times before checking his reflection in the window. His nervous excitement was obvious. We handed our invitations to security personnel. The officer scanned each one. His expression changed the moment he reached mine. He looked at me, then at the screen, then back at me. For a brief second, I thought something was wrong. Instead, he stood a little straighter. "Good morning, ma'am." His tone carried an unusual respect. "Welcome." Clarence noticed immediately. As we walked away, she whispered sarcastically, "Well, someone seems impressed." Chris chuckled. "Maybe they salute everyone now." I smiled politely but said nothing. If they only knew. Inside, the grand hall looked breathtaking. Crystal chandeliers illuminated polished marble floors. Massive American flags hung behind an elevated stage where rows of distinguished officers would soon take their seats. Military bands quietly played patriotic music as guests found their assigned places. Everywhere I looked were decorated uniforms covered with ribbons earned over decades of service. The atmosphere wasn't loud. It was dignified. Respect itself seemed to fill the room. An usher stepped toward us. "May I see your seating assignments?" He examined each invitation carefully. Then he smiled. "This way, please." Our family followed him toward the front of the hall. Row after row of reserved seating passed by. The closer we came to the stage, the wider Clarence smiled. She whispered proudly, "I knew we'd be sitting near the front." Robert nodded in agreement. Chris looked around, clearly enjoying the attention. Then, just as we reached the VIP section, the usher stopped. He glanced at my invitation once more. His expression became thoughtful. He looked toward another staff member across the room, who gave him a subtle nod. Before he could say a single word, Clarence suddenly placed her hand firmly against my shoulder. Her fingers tightened. I looked at her, confused. She leaned close enough that only I could hear her voice. And with a smile still painted across her face for everyone else to admire, she whispered words that would change everything. "Go sit in the back." Clarence's smile never disappeared. To everyone watching, she looked like a graceful, well-mannered woman gently speaking to her stepdaughter. Only I could hear the venom hidden beneath her soft voice. "Go sit in the back." I blinked, certain I had misunderstood. "What?" She squeezed my shoulder harder. "You heard me." Her smile widened as guests continued walking past us. "The front rows are for important people." I stared at her in disbelief. We came together. And now we're sitting separately. Before I could respond, she leaned even closer. "You'll ruin our image." The words landed harder than I expected. Not because they were new, but because I had heard versions of them for almost 20 years. You'll embarrass us. You'll never fit in. You're not one of us. I slowly turned toward my father. He had heard every word. I knew he had. Our eyes met for only a second. He looked away. Not angry. Not embarrassed. Just, unwilling. The silence hurt more than any insult Clarence could have spoken. Dad? I asked quietly. He adjusted the cuff of his jacket without looking at me. Just do what Clarence says. That was it. No explanation. No defense. No hesitation. Just do what Clarence says. Chris let out a quiet laugh. Oh, come on, Emilia. He grinned. Don't make this awkward. He pointed toward the back of the enormous hall. There are plenty of empty seats. His expression carried the same smug confidence it always had whenever he knew nobody would stand up for me. Clarence gave me one final shove. Not enough for others to notice. Just enough for me to lose my balance. Go. I swallowed the lump in my throat. Hundreds of distinguished guests surrounded us. Senior officers. Military families. Government officials. I refused to give Clarence the satisfaction of watching me argue. So I simply nodded. Okay. I turned around and began walking. Each step felt heavier than the last. The closer I moved toward the back rows, the smaller I felt. Not because of where I was sitting. Because once again, my own family had reminded me exactly where they believed I belonged. Behind everyone else. Invisible. An elderly Navy veteran seated along the aisle noticed me searching for a place. He smiled warmly. Miss, this seat is available. Thank you. I sat beside him and quietly folded my hands in my lap. He glanced toward the front of the hall. Family up there? I forced a small smile. Something like that. He nodded without asking another question. Perhaps he understood more than I realized. Some wounds don't require explanations. The music inside the hall softened as more guests took their seats. Conversations echoed beneath the enormous chandeliers. Uniformed officers greeted old friends. Families took photographs. Proud parents straightened medals on their children's dress uniforms. Everywhere I looked, people celebrated one another. Everyone. Except my family. From where I sat, I could clearly see them in the VIP section. Clarence laughed elegantly as she greeted several officers' spouses. Chris shook hands with anyone willing to notice him. My father stood tall, pretending he belonged among people whose sacrifices he barely understood. Not one of them looked back. Not once. For a strange moment. I actually felt relieved. Distance had always been kinder than false affection. As I waited for the ceremony to begin, memories surfaced one after another. I remembered my 16th birthday. Clarence had organized an expensive party. At least, that's what everyone thought. The decorations were beautiful. The dining room sparkled. A giant cake stood in the center of the table. Except, it wasn't my birthday party. It was Chris's, future leader's celebration, after winning a local business competition. My birthday happened to fall on the same weekend. When guests arrived, several wished me a happy birthday. Clarence laughed politely. Oh, today is really about Chris. She handed me a tray. Sweetheart, could you help serve the drinks? I spent my own birthday carrying glasses between guests while everyone congratulated my brother. Later that night I found a small cupcake sitting alone in the kitchen. One candle. No card. No presents. Dad walked in while I was staring at it. For a second, I thought he remembered. Instead he smiled awkwardly. Sorry, today got busy. Then he walked away. I sat alone and blew out my own candle. No wish came true. Another memory followed. Senior year of high school. The National Engineering Challenge. More than 3,000 students had participated across the country. I barely slept for weeks while preparing my project. When the results were announced, I finished first. A full scholarship. Tuition covered. Research opportunities. Everything I had dreamed about. I rushed home holding the acceptance letter. Dad. He looked up from the television. I won. He smiled politely. That's nice. Clarence didn't even look away from her magazine. Chris asked only one question. Does it come with money? I laughed nervously. It covers college. He shrugged. Cool. That evening, Clarence organized another family dinner. Not to celebrate me. To celebrate Chris buying a new sports car. The scholarship certificate stayed folded inside my backpack for almost a week before anyone else saw it. Eventually Mrs. Brooks framed a copy and hung it inside the school hallway. My own teacher valued it more than my own family. Looking back, that was the day I stopped chasing their approval. Or at least I told myself I had. The truth was much more complicated. No matter how successful I became, a small part of me always hoped Dad would someday say, I'm proud of you. Those 4 words never came. The sound of polished shoes approaching interrupted my thoughts. A young Navy lieutenant stopped beside my row. He checked the seat numbers carefully before looking at me. Excuse me, ma'am. Yes? He hesitated. For a moment I thought you might be seated elsewhere. I smiled. This seat is fine. He studied my invitation again. If you need anything during the ceremony. His tone became unexpectedly respectful. Please let one of us know. I appreciate that. He nodded sharply before walking away. The elderly veteran beside me raised an eyebrow. You must be someone important. I laughed softly. I don't think so. He smiled. People don't speak that way unless they recognize responsibility. Before I could answer, the lights dimmed slightly. A calm voice echoed through the hall. Ladies and gentlemen, the ceremony will begin in 5 minutes. The conversation slowly faded. Guests adjusted their uniforms. Medals reflected the crystal lights overhead. The military band prepared to perform. A feeling of quiet anticipation spread through the room. At the front, Clarence immediately fixed her posture. Chris buttoned his jacket. My father straightened his tie for what felt like the 10th time. They looked as though cameras were already watching. I couldn't help smiling to myself. Some people spend their entire lives trying to appear important. Others spend theirs trying to be useful. There is a difference. A very big one. Across the hall, several high-ranking officers entered through a private side entrance. Conversations stopped instantly. Every guest stood. The atmosphere changed. This wasn't ordinary respect. It was reverence. The master of ceremonies stepped onto the stage. His voice carried effortlessly across the room. Good morning, distinguished guests, members of the United States Navy, honored families, and respected officials. It is our privilege to welcome you to today's National Strategic Excellence Recognition Ceremony. The achievements being recognized today represent years of dedication, sacrifice, innovation, and service to our nation. As he continued speaking, I noticed something unusual. Several officers near the stage quietly exchanged brief glances toward the entrance. Almost as if they were waiting for someone. The announcer smiled. And now, please rise to welcome the senior leadership of the United States Navy. Every person in the hall stood at once. The military band began performing. The large ceremonial doors slowly opened. One after another, admirals entered in full dress uniform. Rows of medals gleamed beneath the lights. The room fell completely silent. Then, a figure appeared behind them. Even before I could clearly see his face, I recognized the reaction around the room. Senior officers immediately straightened. Conversations disappeared. Respect filled every corner of the hall. Four-star Admiral Daniel Hopkins had arrived. His white dress uniform looked immaculate. Gold sleeve stripes reflected beneath the chandeliers. Every measured step carried decades of leadership and honor. He acknowledged several officers with small nods before climbing the stage. From the front row, Clarence whispered excitedly to my father. "Oh my goodness! That's Admiral Hopkins." Robert nodded quickly. "I know exactly who he is." Chris leaned forward. "I've seen him on television." Clarence quietly adjusted her necklace again. "Robert, if he comes over here, make sure you introduce yourself properly." My father smiled nervously. "Of course." From the back of the hall, I watched without saying a word. I had met Admiral Hopkins before. Not at ceremonies. Not at banquets. But inside secure briefing rooms where classified projects were discussed behind locked doors. Outside those walls, hardly anyone knew who I was. Inside them, titles meant very little. Results meant everything. That was exactly how I preferred it. The ceremony formally began. Awards were presented. Several officers received medals for extraordinary leadership. The audience applauded each recipient warmly. Nearly 40 minutes passed. Then the master of ceremonies returned to the microphone once again. His expression became noticeably more serious. "Ladies and gentlemen, our final recognition today is unlike any other. It honors an achievement that cannot be fully explained publicly. Certain details will remain classified." A quiet murmur spread across the hall. People exchanged curious glances. Even Clarence leaned closer to hear better. The announcer continued. "To present this honor personally, I respectfully invite Admiral Daniel Hopkins." The audience erupted into applause as the four-star admiral slowly stepped away from the podium. Instead of remaining on stage, he descended the steps. And at that exact moment, every person in the front rows, including my family, became convinced he was walking toward them. Robert instinctively pulled his shoulders back. He smoothed the front of his jacket one more time and quietly cleared his throat, the way people do when they believe an important moment is about to belong to them. Clarence's smile became almost radiant. She leaned toward Chris without taking her eyes off the Admiral. "I told you. This is why appearances matter." Chris nodded confidently. "I bet he's coming to greet the VIP families first." Several people seated nearby turned toward the aisle, expecting the same thing. After all, Admiral Daniel Hopkins wasn't simply another senior officer. He was one of the most respected military leaders in the country. If he stepped off the stage before presenting the final award, surely he intended to greet distinguished guests first. At least, that was what everyone believed. From the last row, I simply watched. I knew Admiral Hopkins well enough to understand one thing. He never wasted a single movement. If he walked somewhere, there was always a reason. The Admiral continued forward at an unhurried pace. His polished shoes echoed softly across the marble floor. Every pair of eyes followed him. The room had become so quiet that even the sound of metals lightly touching one another could be heard. Robert smiled confidently as the Admiral approached. He even took one small step into the aisle. Clarence whispered, "Stand straight." Chris adjusted his tie. The Admiral came closer. 20 feet. 15. 10. Robert extended his hand before the Admiral had even reached him. It is an honor to meet. He never finished the sentence. Without slowing down. Without even turning his head. Admiral Hopkins walked directly past him. Robert's hand remained suspended awkwardly in the air. For a brief second, confusion spread across his face. Clarence blinked. Surely the Admiral hadn't seen him. She forced another smile. Perhaps he intended to greet someone seated just behind them. But the Admiral continued walking. One row passed. Then another. Every guest turned to follow him. Whispers slowly began spreading through the audience. Where is he going? Who is he looking for? Is someone arriving late? The Admiral never looked left. Never looked right. His eyes remained fixed toward the rear of the hall. Toward me. A strange feeling settled inside my chest. Not fear. Recognition. I had seen that expression before. It was the same calm determination he carried into classified briefings whenever a mission had been completed successfully. The elderly Navy veteran sitting beside me noticed the Admiral approaching. He quietly stood. Thinking perhaps someone important was seated behind us. There must be a general back here. I smiled softly. I don't think so. The Admiral came closer. 20 feet. 10. 5. Then. He stopped. Directly in front of me. For one long heartbeat. Neither of us spoke. The entire hall seemed to stop breathing. I slowly rose to my feet. Our eyes met. His expression carried something I had rarely seen outside secure military facilities. Respect. Not for rank. Not for authority. For service. Then, with perfect military precision, 4-star Admiral Daniel Hopkins raised his right hand and saluted me. A flawless salute. Held proudly. Without hesitation. Without apology. Without concern for who was watching. The sound that escaped the audience wasn't applause. It was silence. Complete. Absolute. Disbelief spread across hundreds of faces. Several officers instinctively looked at one another as though confirming what they had just witnessed. Had the highest-ranking admiral in the room just saluted a woman standing alone in the last row? Robert's face turned pale. His mouth slowly opened. No. He whispered. That can't be. Clarence stared as though the world itself had stopped making sense. Chris looked from me to the Admiral and back again. What? He muttered. What is happening? No one answered. Because no one knew. The Admiral lowered his salute and smiled warmly. Good morning, Miss Carter. His voice carried through the silent hall. It is good to see you again. I returned the salute respectfully. Good morning, Admiral. It is an honor. He nodded once. The honor is ours. Behind him, cameras immediately turned toward the back of the room. Photographers who had spent the morning focused on decorated officers suddenly began rushing down the aisles. Television crews quickly repositioned their equipment. Every lens in the hall was now pointed in my direction. Clarence looked around in panic. This has to be some mistake. Robert still hadn't moved. He continued staring at me as though seeing his own daughter for the first time. Perhaps. In that moment. He was. The Admiral turned slightly toward the audience before looking back at me. I apologize. I should have greeted you sooner. I smiled politely. Please don't. You've had an entire ceremony to lead. A faint smile appeared on his face. Still. I don't like keeping extraordinary people waiting. A quiet murmur swept through the room. Extraordinary? People began whispering among themselves. Who is she? Is she military? I've never seen her before. I don't recognize the name. Even several senior officers appeared curious. My work had always existed behind classified doors. Very few people outside that world knew who I was or what I actually did. That anonymity had protected both me and the people I served. The master of ceremonies looked almost emotional as he stepped closer with a microphone. Ladies and gentlemen, I believe many of you are wondering why Admiral Hopkins personally walked to the last row. A few nervous laughs echoed across the room. The Admiral accepted the microphone. Before speaking, he looked directly at me, then at the audience. There is a reason. He paused. And today, it is finally a reason I am permitted to share. Every whisper disappeared. Complete silence returned. The Admiral slowly walked toward the center aisle, inviting me to walk beside him. For a second, I hesitated. Not because I was nervous. Because my eyes drifted toward the front rows. Toward my family. Robert stood completely motionless. His extended hand had long since fallen back to his side. Clarence no longer smiled. The confident woman who had ordered me into the last row only minutes earlier now looked desperately confused. Chris couldn't even meet my eyes. The irony was impossible to ignore. Just minutes earlier, they had worried I would embarrass them by sitting too close. Now, every person in the hall was looking past them, only to watch me. As Admiral Hopkins and I slowly walked toward the center aisle, memories flashed through my mind. Not of awards. Not of ceremonies. But of long nights inside secure laboratories. Windowless rooms filled with glowing computer screens. Weeks without weekends. Months spent solving problems no newspaper would ever report. There had been nights when my team worked 36 hours straight. Coffee cups covered every desk. Eyes burned from staring at encrypted code. One mistake. Just one. Could leave thousands of sailors vulnerable. We carried that responsibility every single day. No headlines. No interviews. No public praise. Success meant nobody ever knew our names. Failure was simply not an option. I remembered the first time Admiral Hopkins visited our facility. He hadn't arrived surrounded by cameras. There were no speeches. No applause. He quietly shook hands with every engineer. When he reached my workstation, he noticed an unfinished simulation running across 3 monitors. Instead of interrupting, he watched silently. After nearly 2 minutes he asked, "Walk me through it." For almost half an hour we discussed vulnerabilities, satellite communications, autonomous defense systems, and cyber warfare. When I finished, he smiled. "How old are you?" 28, sir." He looked genuinely surprised. I expected someone much older. I laughed. I get that a lot. Before leaving, he said something that stayed with me for years. The people standing on the front lines can only be as strong as the people protecting them from behind. From that day forward, he never treated me as merely another engineer. He treated me as someone whose work mattered. Not because of titles. Because of responsibility. Now, years later, that same admiral was walking beside me through a hall filled with America's highest military leaders. And my family still had absolutely no idea who I really was. They had spent years judging me by what I wore, where I lived, how quietly I carried myself. Never once asking the question that actually mattered. What does Emilia do? If they had, everything would have been different. But they never asked. Because people rarely seek the truth about someone they have already decided to underestimate. As we reached the center aisle, Admiral Hopkins stopped once more. He looked toward the stage. Then toward the audience. His voice was calm, confident, and carried the weight of decades in uniform. Ladies and gentlemen, the time has come for all of you to meet the woman who has spent years making sure thousands of American sailors returned home safely. Every eye in the hall followed us. Not a single conversation remained. Not a single phone moved. Even the military band sat perfectly still, their instruments resting quietly in their laps. It felt as if time itself had paused. Admiral Hopkins stood beside me for a long moment before speaking again. He wasn't the kind of man who rushed important words. He understood that some moments deserved silence before they deserved applause. He slowly turned toward the audience. For most of her career, very few people have known her name. That was intentional. The work she does was never meant to receive public recognition. He glanced at me with a proud smile. In fact, if Emilia had been given the choice, I'm certain she would have preferred that today remain just as quiet. A few gentle laughs rippled through the audience. I smiled. He wasn't wrong. I had spent years avoiding attention. The safest technology is often the one no one notices. The strongest defense is usually invisible. That had always been my philosophy. The Admiral continued. When people think about national defense, they picture aircraft carriers, fighter jets, destroyers, submarines. They picture brave men and women wearing uniforms. And they should. They earn that respect every single day. He paused again. But modern warfare has changed. Today, a keyboard can be just as dangerous as a missile. A single cyber attack can disable communications, blind radar, interrupt rescue operations, leave ships exposed. The room remained completely silent. That is why brilliant engineers are every bit as essential to victory as those serving at sea. Several officers nodded. They knew exactly what he meant. The Admiral slowly began walking again, and I followed him toward the stage. Years ago, our intelligence community identified vulnerabilities inside several critical naval defense systems. The challenge was unlike anything we had faced before. Some believed solving it would require many years. Others believed it simply couldn't be done. He looked toward me. One young engineer refused to accept that answer. A giant screen behind the stage suddenly illuminated. The Navy SEAL faded into a simple image. Not classified documents. Not secret facilities. Just a photograph. Mine. I hadn't seen that picture in years. It had been taken inside a secure laboratory after one particularly exhausting project. No makeup. Hair tied back. Safety glasses resting on top of my head. I looked tired. But I also looked happy. Gasps quietly spread throughout the audience. Several people instinctively turned from the screen toward me. The image made everything real. Clarence's expression completely changed. She stared at the screen. Then back at me. Almost desperately searching for some explanation. No. She whispered to herself. That can't be. Robert couldn't stop looking. His daughter. The daughter he barely acknowledged anymore. Displayed on a massive screen beneath the seal of the United States Navy. Chris slowly lowered himself back into his seat. For the first time in his life, he looked genuinely small. The Admiral continued. Emilia Carter joined one of our most advanced defense research programs at an age when many engineers are still completing graduate school. Her interview panel unanimously described her as. He smiled before reading from a small folder. Exceptionally gifted. Calm under pressure. A mind capable of solving problems most people don't even recognize. I remembered that interview. I had almost declined it. The security clearance process alone had taken months. Psychological evaluations. Technical examinations. Background investigations. Hundreds of pages of paperwork. At the time, I wondered if I belonged. Apparently, someone else believed I did. The Admiral closed the folder. But intelligence alone has never impressed me. He looked directly toward the audience. Character does. I have met brilliant people. I have met talented people. I have met ambitious people. What I rarely meet are people willing to carry impossible responsibility without asking for recognition. His voice softened. That is Emilia. The hall remained silent. Not because people were bored. Because they were listening to every word. The Admiral continued. Several years ago, our Navy began developing the Sentinel Integrated Maritime Defense Network. Many of the details remain classified. So I cannot explain everything. But I can tell you this. The project was among the most important technological initiatives in recent naval history. A slide appeared on the giant screen. It showed only a simplified graphic of naval ships connected through secure communications. No classified information. Only enough for the audience to understand the scale. The purpose was simple. Protect every ship. Protect every sailor. Protect every mission. He looked back at me. The responsibility for designing the core defensive architecture fell to one individual. He didn't need to say my name. Everyone already knew. The audience slowly turned toward me again. It required more than intelligence. It required patience. Leadership. Humility. And the courage to accept that if something ever went wrong, the public would never know who failed. But thousands of families would. Those words hit me harder than anyone realized. Because they were true. Every decision my team made carried invisible consequences. People often imagine engineers sitting comfortably behind computers. They never imagine the weight. The sleepless nights. The responsibility. The fear of making a mistake that could cost lives. The Admiral looked back toward the audience. There were countless evenings when Emilia refused to leave the laboratory. I personally instructed her to go home on more than one occasion. A few officers smiled knowingly. I lost every argument. Soft laughter echoed through the hall. I couldn't help smiling myself. He really had tried. Usually around 2 in the morning. He would stop by during inspections and say, "Go get some sleep." My answer was almost always the same. "One more hour, sir." It was never 1 hour. The Admiral chuckled quietly. I eventually stopped asking. More laughter spread through the audience. But then, his smile disappeared. His expression became serious once again. And then came the night that proved why her work mattered. The atmosphere instantly changed. Every smile faded. Everyone sensed the story was about to become something much bigger. The Admiral slowly closed the folder in his hands. I cannot reveal operational details. I cannot disclose locations. I cannot discuss classified missions. But I have received authorization to share the outcome. He paused. Long enough for the silence to settle over the room again. Several American naval assets unexpectedly became the target of an extremely sophisticated coordinated cyber intrusion. The audience listened without moving. Our adversaries believed they had discovered a weakness. They believed they could blind our systems, interrupt secure communications, and compromise operational awareness. The screen behind him changed once again. This time, only a simple timeline appeared. No names. No maps. Just timestamps. Within seconds. Automatic defensive protocols activated. Communications remained secure. Navigation systems continued operating. Threat isolation completed successfully. The Admiral slowly turned toward me. The architecture responsible for that successful defense. He pointed gently toward me. Was designed by Emilia Carter. A wave of quiet astonishment rolled across the audience. Not applause. Not yet. Just stunned realization. The room finally understood. This wasn't simply another engineer. This wasn't simply another award. They weren't honoring someone because she had built software. They were honoring someone whose work had protected countless lives. From the front row, Robert's breathing became noticeably heavier. Pieces of a puzzle he had ignored for years were finally beginning to fit together. The late nights. The confidential phone calls. The unexplained travel. The government vehicles. The conversations she could never discuss. He had dismissed every one of them. He never asked why. He simply assumed they weren't important. Now, he realized how wrong he had been. Clarence slowly covered her mouth with one trembling hand. Only one thought echoed inside her mind. She had pushed this woman. This remarkable woman. Into the last row. Just minutes earlier. And the worst part. She had done it proudly. Not knowing that the woman she considered an embarrassment was about to become the most honored person in the entire building. Clarence couldn't move. The confidence that had filled her face when she arrived at the ceremony had completely vanished. Only minutes earlier she had been worried about who might notice her dress, her jewelry, and the prestigious people sitting around her. Now none of those things mattered. Because every eye in the hall was fixed on only one person. And it wasn't her. It was the stepdaughter she had spent years treating like an inconvenience. Robert slowly lowered himself into his chair, but he wasn't really sitting anymore. His mind had drifted years into the past. He remembered the countless nights Emilia came home late carrying a laptop bag over one shoulder. He remembered asking only once. Working late again? She had smiled gently. Yes, Dad. He never asked another question. He had assumed she was just another engineer working overtime. He never stopped to wonder why government vehicles occasionally dropped her off. Why strangers in military uniforms sometimes called her phone. Why she was unable to discuss work. He had mistaken confidentiality for ordinary routine. Now every memory suddenly carried a completely different meaning. Chris looked down at his polished shoes. For the first time in years, he couldn't laugh. His sister. The sister he constantly mocked for being boring. The sister he teased for driving an old sedan instead of an expensive sports car. The sister he once called the family's biggest disappointment. She had quietly become one of the most respected minds serving the United States Navy. And she had never once used it to make anyone feel small. The realization stung hard. Meanwhile, Admiral Hopkins slowly returned to the center of the stage. He motioned for me to remain beside him. I did. The bright stage lights illuminated the audience, allowing me to see faces that only moments earlier had barely noticed I existed. Now many of those same people looked at me with admiration. Others looked curious. Some looked inspired. It was an unfamiliar feeling. I had spent most of my career hidden behind secure doors where success was measured in silence rather than applause. Being seen felt strange. The master of ceremonies stepped forward and respectfully handed the Admiral another folder. Unlike the previous one, this folder was bound in dark blue leather with the official Navy seal embossed in gold. The Admiral opened it carefully. Ladies and gentlemen, I have shared only a small portion of Emilia Carter's service today. The overwhelming majority of her accomplishments remain classified. He looked toward the audience. And perhaps they always will. He paused. But there are certain facts that the American people deserve to know. He glanced at me before continuing. During the last 8 years, she has led multiple strategic engineering teams. She has trained younger defense specialists. She has authored security protocols now used throughout critical naval infrastructure. She has declined private sector offers worth millions of dollars. A noticeable murmur spread through the room. Millions? Even Robert looked stunned. The Admiral smiled. Yes. Several companies attempted to recruit her. The salaries offered would have changed anyone's life. He looked directly at me. But Emilia's answer never changed. He closed the folder. My work belongs where it protects people. The audience fell silent again. Those words had become famous inside our division. I had said them years earlier during a leadership meeting when someone asked why I refused to leave government service. I never expected anyone outside that room to hear them. Apparently, Admiral Hopkins remembered every word. He continued. Character cannot be purchased. Loyalty cannot be negotiated. And integrity cannot be replaced. Those qualities are infinitely more valuable than talent. The applause began softly. Then spread. Soon the entire hall erupted in appreciation. It wasn't the loud, explosive applause people gave celebrities. It was different. It was respectful. Grateful. Earned. I felt my eyes beginning to fill with tears. Not because of the applause. Because for the first time in a very long time, someone was describing me exactly as I had always hoped to become. Not brilliant. Not exceptional. Simply trustworthy. When the applause finally settled, Admiral Hopkins turned toward me once more. Emilia. He smiled warmly. I've known you for many years. I've watched you solve impossible problems. I've watched you mentor young engineers. I've watched you accept responsibility when things became difficult. But there is something these ladies and gentlemen do not know. He looked back toward the audience. Whenever a project succeeds, Emilia always gives the credit to her team. Whenever something goes wrong, she accepts responsibility herself. He chuckled quietly. I've argued with her about that more than once. A few senior officers laughed knowingly. It's true. One captain in the front rows nodded. Every single time. Another admiral smiled. She's impossible to convince otherwise. The audience laughed gently. The atmosphere had become warmer now. More personal. People weren't simply learning about my accomplishments. They were learning who I was. The Admiral folded his hands behind his back. Leadership is not measured by how loudly someone speaks. It is measured by how quietly others trust them. He looked at me. And Emilia. You have earned that trust. I lowered my head slightly. Thank you, sir. He smiled. No. Thank you. Those 3 words hit me harder than I expected. Because I realized something. In all my years growing up, I had spent so much time trying to hear those words from my father. I wanted him to notice my report cards, my science competitions, my scholarship, my graduation, every achievement, every milestone, every success. Some small part of me had hoped he would finally look at me and say, "Thank you. I'm proud of you." Instead, the words had come from someone who wasn't related to me at all. Someone who knew me not because we shared blood, but because we shared purpose. Sometimes, family is not defined by who raises you. Sometimes, it is defined by who sees you. My eyes drifted toward the front rows. Robert was already looking at me. The moment our eyes met, he looked away. Not out of anger. Out of shame. He couldn't hold my gaze. Perhaps because, for the first time in his life, he realized he had never truly seen his own daughter. Clarence's makeup could no longer hide the tears gathering in her eyes. She wasn't crying because she was proud. She was crying because regret had finally caught up with her. Every cruel remark. Every insult. Every moment she pushed me aside. Every holiday where Chris received everything while I received almost nothing. Every memory was now returning to her all at once. Regret has a cruel habit. It waits patiently, then arrives all at once. The Admiral stepped toward the ceremonial podium placed at the center of the stage. Upon it rested a polished wooden presentation case lined with deep blue velvet. Inside lay the highest civilian technological service medal awarded by the Department of the Navy. Several members of the audience quietly straightened in their seats. Even experienced officers recognized its significance. It was not presented often. In fact, many spent entire careers without ever witnessing someone receive it. The Master of Ceremonies announced, by authority of the Secretary of the Navy, for extraordinary contributions to national security, for exceptional leadership in strategic defense innovation, and for distinguished service resulting in the protection of United States naval personnel. This honor is proudly presented to. He smiled toward me. Emilia Carter. The audience rose to its feet before he could even finish speaking. A standing ovation swept across the hall. The sound echoed beneath the high ceilings like rolling thunder. Some officers applauded with visible emotion. Several veterans nodded proudly. Young midshipmen watched with expressions of pure inspiration. Because standing before them wasn't a decorated combat commander. It was an engineer. A woman who had proven that courage isn't always found on a battlefield. Sometimes, it is found in the quiet determination to solve problems that save lives. Admiral Hopkins carefully lifted the medal from its velvet case. He stepped toward me. The applause gradually softened. Then stopped. The hall fell silent once more. He looked directly into my eyes. His voice was calm, steady, filled with unmistakable respect. Emilia Carter. On behalf of every sailor whose life has been made safer because of your work, it is my greatest privilege to present you with this honor. For a brief moment, neither of us moved. The medal rested in Admiral Hopkins' hands, its gold surface reflecting the bright lights above the stage. The entire hall was silent. I could hear my own heartbeat. Not because I had never received recognition before. I had. Private commendations. Letters of appreciation. Classified awards presented behind closed doors. But this was different. This wasn't happening inside a secure conference room surrounded by people who already knew my work. This was happening in front of hundreds of military leaders. And in front of the 3 people who had spent years convincing me I would never be enough. Admiral Hopkins stepped closer. With great care, he placed the ribbon around my neck. As the medal settled against my chest, the audience once again rose into thunderous applause. Some officers clapped with military precision. Others smiled warmly. Several veterans wiped tears from their eyes. They understood what this moment represented. It wasn't simply about an award. It was about recognizing someone whose victories would never appear on the evening news. Someone whose greatest successes were measured by disasters that never happened. The applause continued for nearly a full minute. When it finally softened, Admiral Hopkins extended his hand. I shook it firmly. He leaned closer so that only I could hear him. I told you years ago. The country would know your name someday. I smiled through the tears forming in my eyes. I remember. He nodded. And today is only the beginning. Those words carried more weight than anyone around us realized. Because years earlier, during one particularly difficult project, I had nearly resigned. The pressure had become overwhelming. Weeks without sleep. Constant security reviews. Endless technical failures. I had begun questioning whether I belonged in a position carrying so much responsibility. One evening, Admiral Hopkins visited our laboratory. He found me sitting alone in front of 3 computer screens after almost 20 hours of work. Without saying a word, he placed 2 cups of coffee on my desk. He sat beside me. Neither of us spoke for several minutes. Finally, he asked, "Thinking about quitting?" I laughed quietly. "Is it that obvious?" He nodded. The best people usually question themselves. The dangerous ones never do. I looked at him. What if I'm not good enough? He didn't answer immediately. Instead, he pointed toward one of the digital maps displayed across my monitors. How many sailors are relying on this system? I quietly replied. Thousands. And how many of them know your name? None. He smiled. Exactly. They don't need to. They just need you to keep showing up tomorrow. That conversation changed my life. Whenever exhaustion made me doubt myself, I remembered those words. Just keep showing up tomorrow. Now, standing beside him on the national stage, I realized he had been doing much more than leading an organization. He had quietly been mentoring people like me all along. The master of ceremonies returned to the microphone. Ladies and gentlemen, before concluding today's ceremony, Admiral Hopkins has requested the opportunity to say a few personal words. The audience immediately settled back into their seats. The Admiral stood at the podium once more. He rested both hands lightly against its polished surface. I have spent more than 4 decades serving in the United States Navy. I have commanded ships. I have led fleets. I have stood beside extraordinary men and women. And if my years in uniform have taught me anything, it is this. He paused. Never underestimate the quiet person in the room. His eyes slowly moved across the audience. The loudest voice is rarely the strongest. The brightest spotlight rarely shines upon the person carrying the greatest responsibility. He turned toward me. When Emilia first joined our defense programs, she spoke very little. She preferred listening. While others competed for attention, she competed against problems. Soft laughter spread through the audience. The Admiral smiled. I remember asking one of her supervisors to describe her. He opened a folded piece of paper. I kept his answer. He adjusted his glasses before reading. If Emilia says a system is secure, you sleep better that night. Gentle laughter turned into heartfelt applause. He folded the paper once more. I have never forgotten that sentence. Because trust is the highest compliment any professional can receive. He looked toward the younger officers seated throughout the hall. I know many of you are early in your careers. You dream about promotions, titles, recognition. There is nothing wrong with ambition. But remember something. Your reputation is built long before anyone hands you an award. It is built during ordinary Tuesdays, late nights, difficult conversations, moments when nobody is watching. The room remained completely silent. Every word felt personal. Even those who had never met me seemed to understand the deeper lesson. Success isn't created on the day of recognition. It is created in the thousands of invisible days that come before it. The Admiral then did something no one expected. Instead of ending his speech, he stepped away from the podium and faced me again. Emilia. I know public speaking has never been your favorite activity. The audience laughed softly. I can confirm that. He smiled. But today, I believe everyone here deserves to hear from you. He gently offered me the microphone. For one brief second, I froze. Speaking to engineering teams was easy. Briefing intelligence officials was routine. Explaining complex systems never frightened me. Talking about myself, that was different. I slowly accepted the microphone. The hall became perfectly still. Hundreds of faces looked toward me, including 3 faces sitting in the front row. I took one slow breath. My name is Emilia Carter. A gentle smile spread across the audience. I've spent most of my career hoping people would notice the work, instead of the person doing it. A few heads nodded. So standing here today feels a little overwhelming. Quiet laughter echoed through the hall. I honestly believed I would spend my entire career behind secure doors. And I was perfectly happy with that. I looked toward the rows filled with sailors and officers. I didn't choose engineering because I wanted awards. I chose it because I wanted to solve problems. When I was little, I used to take apart clocks, radios, old appliances. My family thought I was making a mess. The audience laughed again. I simply wanted to understand how things worked. I smiled. I suppose that never really changed. More laughter followed. Then my expression became more serious. I've learned something over the years. Every sailor standing watch through the night trusts equipment they've never personally inspected. They trust people they may never meet. They trust engineers. They trust analysts. They trust technicians. They trust thousands of invisible professionals working quietly behind them. I paused. And that trust is sacred. The hall remained silent. I've never worn the uniform. But every single day, I've tried my best to deserve the confidence of those who do. A long wave of applause interrupted my speech. When it faded, I continued. No achievement belongs to one person. The systems we've built. The lives we've protected. The missions we've supported were possible only because of extraordinary teammates who believed excellence was never optional. I looked toward several familiar faces seated among the senior staff. Many smiled back. Some nodded. One engineer discreetly wiped away tears. I smiled. If any member of my team is watching today, this medal belongs to all of us. The audience stood once again. Another standing ovation filled the hall. Longer than the first. Stronger than the first. As I looked across the crowd, my eyes slowly found my father again. This time, he wasn't looking away. He was crying. Not quietly. Not secretly. Openly. The applause echoed all around him. But I had the feeling he wasn't hearing any of it. He was listening only to the memories he wished he could change. The applause continued long after I lowered the microphone. For nearly 2 full minutes, no one in the grand hall sat down. Hundreds of military officers, decorated veterans, government officials, and their families remained standing. Not because protocol required it. Because respect demanded it. I looked across the sea of faces, trying to absorb what was happening. For most of my life, I had dreamed of being accepted by 3 people. My father. My stepmother. My brother. Instead, I had somehow earned the respect of an entire room full of strangers. Life has a strange way of teaching us that sometimes the recognition we spend years chasing comes from places we never expected. Eventually, the applause began to fade. The master of ceremonies smiled warmly. "Ladies and gentlemen, on behalf of the United States Navy, please join me one final time in congratulating Ms. Emilia Carter." Another round of applause echoed through the hall before everyone slowly returned to their seats. The formal ceremony had officially concluded. Military musicians began playing a quiet patriotic melody in the background. Guests started talking among themselves. Many officers stepped toward the stage, waiting patiently for an opportunity to shake my hand. Several young naval engineers approached first. One young woman, who couldn't have been older than 24, stopped in front of me with tears in her eyes. "Ma'am." She smiled nervously. "I joined the engineering corps because I wanted to make a difference." She looked down at the medal around my neck. "Today you reminded me why." I smiled warmly. "Never let anyone convince you your work doesn't matter." She nodded. "I won't." Another young officer extended his hand. "Thank you for protecting people you'll probably never meet." I shook his hand. "They're worth protecting." One by one, people continued introducing themselves. Captains, commanders, scientists, cybersecurity specialists. Some wanted photographs. Others simply wanted to say thank you. Each conversation lasted only a few moments. But every one of them reminded me of something important. Respect isn't created by titles. It's created by consistency. Nearly 20 minutes passed before the crowd around me finally began to thin. That was when I noticed someone standing several feet away. My father. Robert. He wasn't moving. He wasn't speaking. He simply stood there, staring at me with an expression I had never seen before. Regret. Real regret. Not embarrassment. Not pride. Pain. Clarence stood several steps behind him. Her confident posture had disappeared completely. Even Chris looked uncomfortable. For a long moment, none of us spoke. Finally, Dad slowly walked toward me. Each step seemed heavier than the last. When he reached me, he stopped. His eyes filled with tears again. "I'm..." His voice cracked. "I'm so sorry." Those 3 words hung between us. Words I had waited years to hear. "I failed you." He lowered his head. "I wasn't there when you needed me. I saw things I should have stopped. I stayed silent. And my silence hurt you." I listened quietly. He wasn't making excuses. For the first time, he was telling the truth. I kept thinking there would always be another chance. He shook his head. "I thought we'd have more time." "I never imagined." He looked around the magnificent hall. "I never imagined I'd have to learn who my daughter really was from an admiral." His shoulders trembled. "And that's my greatest shame." For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then I gently placed my hand over his. "Dad, you didn't lose me today. You started losing me years ago." He closed his eyes. "I know." Clarence slowly stepped forward. She looked nothing like the elegant woman who had pushed me toward the back row. Her eyes were red from crying. "I'm ashamed of myself," she whispered. "I spent years judging you. I thought success meant appearances. Money. Status." She looked at the medal around my neck. "I never understood what real greatness looked like." Tears rolled down her cheeks. "And today, you showed me." She took a shaky breath. "I don't expect forgiveness. I just needed you to know. I was wrong. Completely wrong." Chris remained silent for several seconds before finally speaking. I used to make fun of you. He laughed bitterly. I thought I was smarter. I thought I was more successful. He looked down. The truth is, I never even tried as hard as you did. He managed a weak smile. You won without ever competing against us. You were only competing against yourself. I looked at all three of them. For years, I had imagined this exact moment. I thought it would make me feel victorious. Satisfied. Maybe even happy. Instead, I felt something else. Peace. Holding on to anger had been exhausting. Letting it go felt lighter. I smiled gently. I spent a long time wishing all of you would finally see me. I don't need that anymore. They listened silently. But I'm glad you do now. Dad nodded through his tears. So, he whispered. Can you ever forgive us? I looked toward the stage where Admiral Hopkins was speaking with several senior officers. Then I looked back at my family. Forgiveness doesn't erase the past. It simply refuses to let the past control the future. I forgive you. Clarence covered her face and quietly cried. Chris looked away, wiping his eyes. Dad embraced me carefully. Not with confidence. Not assuming he had earned it. Almost as though he was asking permission. After a brief moment, I hugged him back. Not because the past had disappeared. Because carrying it forever would only keep hurting both of us. As we stepped apart, Admiral Hopkins approached with a warm smile. I hope I'm not interrupting. Dad immediately straightened himself. No, Admiral. Hopkins looked at him kindly. You raised an extraordinary daughter. Robert lowered his eyes. No. He answered honestly. She became extraordinary despite my mistakes. The Admiral placed a reassuring hand on his shoulder. What matters now is what you do next. Dad nodded slowly. I won't waste another chance. The Admiral smiled. I believe you. Before leaving, he turned toward me one final time. Emilia. There will always be another project. Another challenge. Another mission. But don't forget to live your life too. I laughed softly. I'll try, sir. He smiled. I know you will. As he walked away, I looked once more across the grand hall. Only an hour earlier, I had been sitting alone in the very last row. Ashamed. Rejected. Invisible. The same people who believed I belonged in the back had watched me walk to the most honored place in the room. Not because I demanded respect. Not because I argued. Not because I tried to prove them wrong. But because years of quiet dedication had spoken louder than words ever could. As we left the building together, the afternoon sun bathed Washington, D.C., in a warm golden light. For the first time in many years, I didn't feel like the forgotten daughter walking behind everyone else. I walked beside them. Not because I needed their approval. Because I had finally found something much more valuable. My own. And if there's one lesson I hope you take away from this story, it's this. Never let someone else's opinion become the limit of your potential. People may underestimate your silence. They may mistake your kindness for weakness. They may decide your worth long before they know your story. Let them. Keep learning. Keep working. Keep showing up. Because one day, your character will speak so loudly that even those who doubted you won't be able to ignore it. Sometimes the people who push you to the back row become the very ones who watch you stand on the highest stage. And when that day comes, don't let success fill your heart with pride. Let it fill your heart with purpose. Because the greatest victory isn't making your enemies feel small. It's becoming the person you were always meant to be. If this story touched your heart, don't forget to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share it with someone who needs the reminder that quiet strength is still strength. Thank you for watching.